And he was a reporter for Fairfax Radio. Not
a very moderate guy.
He is, Michael Packy, good journo. Look, but I don't think, though, the media should be above scrutiny. It's absolutely fair to have a look at how the media's been treating this issue. Jeff Gallop, do you think the media's been balanced and fair in covering the climate change debate?
Well, I think let's look at the Greens, as a political party within the system. We just criticised them earlier for not supporting the emissions trading system. And I was on this program with you last time, David, I made that point. But now he's in the system. He's made a decision to try and influence government from within the parliament, within the system, rather than taking a fundamentalist approach. But if you read the media, you'd think that the Greens are sort of simply not part and parcel of the proper debate we're having on this issue. So I think Bob Brown's got a point. That they haven't really treated the Greens' move from a fundamentalist position to a real influence over government position. And this has happened to Green parties all through Europe, and I think it's a good thing for Australian politics. And yet he's being bagged all the time.
But you don't think the media is giving enough scrutiny, or at least treating the Greens like they are a serious player?
Well, I think certainly the Australian has a particular view on all these things, and that's fine. But there's no doubt that their view is not that the Greens should be anywhere near government in Australia. And if I was Bob Brown, I guess I'd be a bit stroppy too when they continue to pursue that line, when he's made a decision on behalf of the many people who voted for him to work within a democratic system to get results. He should be given 10 out of 10 for that.
But, Jeff, it's a bit like election night in New South Wales when we had various former ministers in the government who were blaming the Murdoch press. It was all their fault. And saying,
Bruce,
don't you think you had something to work with?
Yeah, but Bruce, we need bipartisanship on this issue. And it's a tragedy that the Liberal Party haven't supported it. It's a tragedy that the Greens didn't support it. And now he's trying to move to that end. In the national interest, he ought to be given 10 out of 10.
I think, David, in relation to the carbon price, there's been a level of moral outrage and hysteria and over-the-top coverage which I don't think is warranted by the facts. And you can look at other issues of promises in the Victorian Parliament. The Liberal government's walked away from promises on.
What's been hysterical about pointing out the impact of the carbon tax? I mean, yes, there's comment pieces, but in the news coverage,
it has. It's just day in and day out when the government is working through the multi-party committee on climate change and clearly has not resolved questions of detail for good reason, because it's engaged in consultation with business and with non-government organisations and other parties.
Sure, but we're entitled to ask what's Labor's starting position, or what's the Greens' starting position on things like the price. Why can't Bob Brown tell us
every day? No, you can't answer questions which you simply haven't got to.
If someone asks you what position you take going into a series of negotiations,
if someone says to you, David, who are you going to have on this panel next week or a fortnight's time or 3 weeks' time, you say, well, look, I haven't decided. I haven't thought about that.
I can tell you who I'd like to have. That's the point. I'm asking what your position is, your desire, what end point you want, what outcome you want.
When you're engaged in negotiations and haven't worked out questions of detail, it is not reasonable to badger people about questions of detail.
The only reason he's not saying it, or anyone won't say it in this situation, is they don't want to be embarrassed at the other end when they don't get what they want.
If you're engaged in good faith negotiations, you don't walk out with a megaphone and say, today in the meeting we said this is our position, or this is our bottom line.
This is what we want to deliver.
This is what has been expected of the government or the Greens or others, that they will provide detail when this is a matter of work in progress.
No, I think we're on the wrong page here. We're not asking detail. We're asking what your position would be. Yeah. What would you like to see achieved?
Well, that's the same thing. If you're saying what is the position you are taking into the negotiations today, that is not reasonable. When you're engaged in good faith negotiations, that is a question of discussions and keeping confidence with the people who you're having the negotiations with.
A couple of points here. I mean, that is a very different attitude, of course, than what the Labor Party had in opposition, because we remember in opposition that when there was policy work being done on contentious issues, the Labor Party took much joy with the unions or whoever else in trying to expose those sorts of issues before the detail
we'd go into the House and we'd have vegetables in packs, and cream,
hockey bear,
pyjamas.
I confessed freely that we had a field day with the GST prior to its being put into place. After it was put in place, it was a very different thing.
One of the great criticisms of the workplace relations reform in 2005 was that there was a framework announced without the detail. And the Labor Party, every single day in question time, asked the former Prime Minister to guarantee no worker would be worse off. There is no
The problem with work choices wasn't the lack of detail, Jamie. It was the detail once you provided it that was the problem.
The problem here with what Bob Brown's going through, I think, all due respect to our former Premier over here, is that he's actually struggling to make the step from being an activist to being a leader of a government. And in effect, he's a leader of a government. He's in coalition.
That's not true.
No, he's in coalition with the Prime. He's now been held to account. So 2 days ago, in the old days, the Greens could say whatever they liked. They could give all sorts of character assessments or commentary to the government of the day. 2 days ago, Sarah Hanson-Young, the rising senator from South Australia, the likely next leader of the Greens, floats the idea of $100 per tonne.
Well, she didn't exactly do that. She said
that's what you would need. That's the price you would need.
Let's get to this issue. Let's get to the substance of this issue. It's about the debate over the price, right?
I think
the carbon
it's perfectly legitimate for the opposition to be aggressive because it's opposition. It's perfectly legitimate for the media to try and get a politician to make a mistake on some of these things.
Well, give an answer, not make a mistake. Give an answer.
Don't expect them, as Kelvin says, to reveal what the negotiation positions are. I mean, that's just
all right. So we shouldn't ask politicians what their position is.
I think with Bob Brown, all that's happening here is that people are actually starting to ask what your ideas are. What do they actually mean? There's some actually general assessment
being done. But Jamie, we know what the ideas are. The ideas are we need a carbon tax to go into the system to change our behaviour. Secondly, we need all sorts of mechanisms in place to manage that implementation so that the community feel that if there's any disadvantage involved for any sector, that it's being dealt with properly. And thirdly, we need an overarching argument about all of these things, which is, the state of the international environment and all those issues. Now, that's the Labor position.
Okay, well,
so what's the problem?
Dealing with the specific...
Can I just say that if you've got you start talking about trade-offs and these polluting industries will get compensated, export-exposed companies will get compensated, and you just start to think, well, basically, where does this work? If it's not a market mechanism is going to affect polluters, then where are we at? And I think that's where you leave.
That's a point. It's got to do that.
Jeff, you're not in the negotiations, obviously.
No.
Let me ask you, the whole point of this is to shift energy use from dirty coal-fired power to cleaner energy sources. That's the point of it, right? So when this report this week, commissioned by the government, says you're going to need a $40 price to do that, would you support that? I mean, what's the point of doing it if we're not going to get people to shift?
That's the point.
I'm not privy to the very detailed arguments about what different prices would do to behaviour. But what I would say it's got to be a price that has a bite to it. But you can't only deal with the price issue. I mean, I think the big failings of Australian public policy in recent years, particularly on the coal question, has not to see that we could have a national gas strategy as a transition fuel, and...
Spoken like a true West Australian.
But, these things should be raised.
Let's just get a couple of quick final points on this.
In response to this, David, you wouldn't be going to $40 a tonne from zero. That would be too great a shock. The European emissions trading scheme never started out like that. It started off small, and you gradually get to understand the system. Business and industry gets to understand the system, and the carbon price works from there.
But you've got to get up to that point, haven't you?
That scheme has worked quite well. It is significant that in the UK
you've got to get up to that price, haven't you? Otherwise it's not worth it.
It's not a question of saying what price you've got to get up to. It's a question of being able to introduce the scheme and then let the market work to achieve your carbon reduction targets. And the European scheme has been working. It is significant that the UK is able to say this scheme has worked for us, and we are now going to try and reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by 2025. So they are able to set a really ambitious target off the back of a scheme which has been in place for a decade. The sky has not fallen in.
The target is the point here, and the target from the Labor Party and the Liberal Party is exactly the same. 5% by 2020. We have an argument about how we get there. That's what the argument's about.
And the problem with your scheme is that it won't get there, and that's why Malcolm Turnbull won't embrace it. He knows it won't get there.
And there's no chance the coalition will drop that 5% goal?
No, that's our policy. We're committed to 5% by 2020, and we've got a policy which will get us there.
All right. We're going to have to move on to some other issues after the break. We'll look at the asylum seeker debate, in particular what's going to happen to the 100 or so boat people who've arrived and the Malaysian deal still not signed. Stay with us.
Earth.